Good evening, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Airwolf Season 1 on Blu-ray. Now, Airwolf was a show that was created by a guy named Don Belisario, and he was the gentleman behind shows such as Magnum PI, Quantum Leap, JAG, and NCIS. Pretty good company to be in. And Airwolf lasted for 4 seasons, which is a decent run for any show when you get right down to it. But it was definitely a product of its time, since it came out in the 80s, and in a lot of ways very ahead of its time, but also of its time. So the basic gist of it was that there was this helicopter, a very cutting edge prototype, it went by the code name of Airwolf, and Airwolf was in turn hijacked by its creator, a mad scientist by the name of Moffat, who basically wants to cause untold amounts of chaos, and doesn't really care who he has to hurt to do it, or who gets screwed in the long run. And he basically takes the copter to Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi was still alive at the time, and it basically he has the chance to start World War III just based on firepower alone that the copter has. And so there's a group called the Firm, which is sort of a takeoff on various branches of the CIA, and they send a representative, a guy by the name of Archangel, played by Alex Cord, to look up a guy named Stringfellow Hawk, who was in turn the pilot who put the copter through its paces when it was being designed and developed. And he's, other than the mad scientist who created it, Hawk is the one guy who has more experience than anyone else operating it. And Hawk was played by Jan Michael Vincent, and this was kind of a signature role for him. And anyway, so Hawk and Archangel kind of go way back a few ways because of this association with the research and the design of Airwolf. And so Hawk, in order to get the copter back, which is what the Firms want him to do, he looks up an old friend of his, a guy named Dominique Santini, played by the late great Ernest Borgnine, who was kind of a surrogate father to him, the father he never had. The two did a lot of aviation work together, got each other through some tough times, and also both had military background. Dominique was a Korean War vet, Hawk was a Vietnam vet. So anyway, though, the two of them, they team up to go behind enemy lines to get Airwolf back and get returned to the Firm. So once they do so, after an insane amount of destruction is caused over in Libya, they get the copter back, but instead of returning it to the Firm like they initially agreed on doing, they decide to essentially hold Airwolf for ransom. The reason being is that Hawk has a brother who was listed as MIA in Vietnam. Now, no one seems to know if he's alive or dead. All it's known is that he's missing. And so Hawk, he tells Archangel, hey, you'll get your copter back once you use your resources with the Firm to find out what happened to my brother. Is he alive, dead? I think he's alive. I just want to know what happened and where he is. And if he's dead, I need to know. And so in return for this, Hawk and Santini, through Archangel running interference with the Firm, they agreed to go on certain missions that the firm basically can't get their hands dirty with. As long as they won't try and track Hawk and Santini down, allegedly, as long as the two of them go on missions that they need to have undertaken under the supervision of Archangel, of course. And Archangel, in return, will keep them from hunting them down. And so that was the basic setup of the show. Each episode dealt with Hawk and Santini using Airwolf to undertake these missions, and seeing how this was made in the 80s, there's a lot of Cold War stuff going on here. There's oftentimes, domestic threats, but there's also threats from abroad, primarily from, the Russians, who kind of were enemies at the time. Or they were, what am I saying? Anyway, though, the first season, I believe, lasted like 11 episodes altogether, including the pilot. So it was a very short season compared to what a lot of people might be used to. But I actually found that length to be very efficient, for setting up a good first season. Now, to be fair, the pilot, it kind of made me think of another show that I like called Babylon 5, in the sense that you had a pilot movie that had, to the discerning viewer, there's enough good in it to where you could see where a good show could be made, but the pilot itself honestly wasn't that good. So if you're not that discerning of a viewer, you might not really give the pilot a chance. But if you're of the mindset that, okay, what I'm watching, this pilot isn't exactly, the best thing I've ever seen, but there are some good things about it that could be developed into something better. And so once the pilot's over, once the first proper episode comes into play, things begin to flow at a much better rate, and you get a good show. And one of the things that I appreciate about this season in particular is that while storytelling has improved immensely since the 80s, there was a certain grittiness to it that not a lot of shows of its time had, or if they might have flirted with it here and there, but they weren't quite as dark as this show, or at least this season, could be at times. A lot of the shows, it seemed to be, if I remember correctly, were more like fun games, maybe a serious episode here and there, but a lot of the episodes in this season were actually, kind of serious. There were some funny moments here and there. There were even some cute moments, that kind of thing. But overall, though, you really felt like there were some really high stakes being played for here, and I actually appreciated that. And characters, just because a character is introduced, like say like they're a guest star, that's prominently billed, or they might have a charisma to them, that didn't necessarily guarantee that they would survive, that kind of thing. And there were certain twists and turns on some of these episodes that, while in by modern standards are kind of predictable, they, for the time, kind of kept, I get the impression that they kind of kept the audience guessing, because there were some episodes where I got the feeling I knew what was going to happen, how certain twists were going to come up, but it was done well enough to where I wanted to see how these twists would play out. And even though I had a good feeling that I was right, I wanted to see if I actually was right. Like, okay, is, say, a certain character, say if they're being antagonistic, okay, is this character being being a jerk, or are they actually a bad guy? Or if there is a bad guy, is it someone else and this guy's just being a jerk? That kind of thing. And they would do some pretty good tricks with stuff like that. And the other thing is that this whenever there was any sort of combat scene with the helicopter in question, it looks amazing. Okay. Whether it be aerial dogfights or enemies on the ground trying to take the copter down, it looks like anytime there's a combat scene, it looks like there's a real fight on hand. And even though it's fiction, the fact that they actually have stuff blowing up for real, like actual vehicles getting blown up, real weapons fire, things like that, it definitely gives this show kind of, a boost in terms of, how awesome it looks in these scenes, compared to, a lot of shows that rely on CGI, wherein it might look awesome, but that nothing's really getting blown up. Whereas here, this was the 80s. They had to use real things, whether it be models or, decommissioned, property or, what have you. But the fact is, just stuff was really being destroyed and it looked amazing. So, so for like the action junkie and all of us, this was good. Just in terms of the action, yeah, it was awesome. Now, I could say that, but then you could have a show where it's like, okay, it looks awesome, when there's action happening, but okay, how are the characters? Do we care about the characters enough to be invested in what's going on? And I would have to say, actually, yeah. Jan Michael Vincent, he was a big star in the 70s. That was probably when, in terms of acting, he was at his best. But Airwolf was a show that, basically made him kind of a household name for a certain amount of time. And he's pretty good in it, at least as far as this season goes. He plays the, tough loner, who, with the occasional, darkly comical streak. But the thing is, like, he doesn't open up around people very much. So, at least as far as most of the first season goes, he's not a very verbose person. But he has a certain intensity about him, which really works well for the character. And also, he plays very well with Ernest Borgnine, who I thought was fantastic as Dominique Santini. Dominique Santini is just that grandpa that, we all, on some level, wish that we had. Okay, we hope if you have an awesome grandpa, yeah, okay. If you watch Airwolf and you're like, okay, I can see a bit of Dominique Santini in my grandpa, that kind of thing. So, he's a really happy-go-lucky type. Basically faces, things with a grin on his face, regardless of how crazy they might get. But at the same time, though, he knows when to be serious, and he knows when, hey, we need to bring some levity to the situation. He's not all doom and gloom, but at the same time, he also knows the risks they're playing for. And so he's the father that Hawk never had. And, he's got his back all the way through. And so Vincent and Borgnine, they work very well together. You got stoic and serious and optimistic and, happy working together. And it makes for an unexpected combination. It's an unlikely combination, but the two of them work well together. Whether they're socializing, outside of missions, or whether they're in the copter, geared up and ready to go, you believe that these two have each other's back and that they've been lifelong friends. Alex Cord as Archangel, I really liked his character. I mean, he looks a little goofy with the eye patch. He's missing an eye, but instead of like having an actual eye patch, for the most part, they just have like a part of his lens. Well, one of the lenses literally like blacked out with sort of a makeshift patch, which it looks weird. And he also has this white suit. And I guess you could say like good guys wear white. That kind of. I guess that's what they were going for. I think they actually were going for that. They even talk about that in one of the episodes. So he looks kind of weird in that sense, but his character was, I really have liked his character because you know that technically his character is kind of is on the side of good, but at the same time, you know that his interests is ultimately with the firm. I mean, he might have some fondness for Stringfellow Hawk, and he is willing to try and pull strings to help him out. But the thing is, at the end of the day, his mission is to get the helicopter back. And if that means having to use certain parties to, do so without them knowing about it, or if it means, doing something unethical, he might be more than willing to do it. It just depends on the situation. And, I like that fact that sometimes you can't tell what side he's going to be on. I mean, more than likely he's going to, be with Hawk on Hawk's side, but at the same time, he might be playing him or to, carry out something for the firm. And there were a couple episodes that I thought that did a really good job of portraying that moral ambiguity. Like there was an episode where there was an arms dealer that initially Hawk and Co are going to try and take out, but Archangel tells him to, hey, back off on this one. And at first they're like, why? This guy's a scumbag. He's a former war criminal, with a, gun with, an illegal arms empire. Why don't you want us to take him out? And it turns out that this guy had actually done some work for the firm, whether directly or indirectly, in the past. And because they had worked with this guy, they'd been able to basically, keep certain global war situations from getting worse than they were. Basically they made sure that this guy, yes, they let him sell arms, but they made sure that he only sold arms to enemies that they knew that they could take out when it came down to it, as opposed to, say, they try and take him out of the picture and he runs and sells arms to the Russians, which at the time were probably one of the few foes that the United States couldn't quite say with confidence that they could, beat, in one-on-one combat. So anyway, though, point being, there were certain there were moments where that little bit of moral ambiguity when it came to government agencies was touched upon, and Hawk and Santini were kind of put in a spot where, okay, do we go along with this, or do we follow our conscience? And I appreciated that. I'm not saying every single episode was that complex, but I just like that bit of realism. And a lot of the episodes, I can't really think of a bad episode as far as the first season goes. Like most of the episodes, I would say were good, but there were maybe I would say maybe three or yeah, probably three what I would call great episodes. And the good to great episodes, I think at their best, they kept things, I mean, it was going to be predictable, but at the same time, they would either present a challenge for, Airwolf and Co. Um, and like whether it be a foe that they weren't sure they could beat, or maybe they would throw an unexpected obstacle that damaged the copter, which at this point was definitely a superior vehicle. But when something like that happened, it established that this thing was not invincible. Like it could take a lot of damage, but it was still just a machine. Or on the other hand, the episodes that dealt with morally complex issues, I thought really, as I said, stood out. And and the grittiness that came into play, when stuff like that was touched on, I think elevated the show, to where, I mean, yeah, it's an 80s show, but you felt like you were watching something with some substance to it. Um, I would say that, you know, one of the things I also appreciated is that, as far as the moral ambiguity goes, is that, I mean, yeah, the Russians were primarily portrayed as the enemy in most episodes that they were in, but it also took time to show that in some episodes that, um, not all the Russians were bad. I mean, yeah, they were on the opposing side, but there were innocent people not only on the American side but on the Russian side too. So I like the fact that in some of the episodes it took the time to show that the Cold War was affecting both sides. It wasn't just mustache twirling villainy, all the way through. It was, okay, yeah, these guys are enemies, but at the same time, there are human beings there, and I appreciated that. Um, and also, there were a few episodes where the twists were predictable, but the way they carried them out, were very inventive. Like there was one episode where it dealt with the plot device of one of the characters being in a coma, supposedly for a year or two, and basically you're trying to figure out, okay, what's really going on here? Was this guy really in a coma at all, or is this just like an enemy ploy? And they do a good job of wanting you of making you want to see how it turns out. And also there was another thing that I liked about it. This wasn't necessarily like a science fiction show, even though the helicopter itself was cutting edge for when it was made, for the time, or at least with what you're seeing on screen. But there may have been an episode or two that touched on the fact that this helicopter was designed with a very limited form of artificial intelligence. And whenever that was brought up, there was a little bit, it sort of edges into sci-fi territory ever so slightly, but the way it was done was actually pretty cool, to the point where that didn't dominate things. And in fact, whenever it was brought up, it may have been like for one episode, or two, but it wasn't to the point of the show ends up becoming Quantum Leap or anything like that. But when it is brought up, it's believable for the show it takes place in. In fact, I believe it's the next to last episode. It's called Mind of the Machine, and guest starring David Carradine, of all people, who as one of the guys who almost got to fly Airwolf, but instead was relegated to putting together virtual combat training simulations, for whoever was going to be flying Airwolf, which in this case was Stringfellow Hawk. So you have not only David Carradine doing a pretty good job in a guest role, that kind of keeps you guessing. Okay, is he just a guy with a grudge against Hawk for stealing his spot, or is he a bad guy? But there's a really cool scene where he's his character is making the realization that Airwolf actually does have the limited capability of thinking, to some degree. Basically, it's able to learn from whatever combat situations it's been in, and any information it gets, it holds on to. So that way, whoever's flying it has access to it, and so they know how to defend themselves against and Airwolf against the enemy in the future. And the way Carradine played it, it was like he was basically a scientist making the realization that he had. He was interacting with something that was almost alive, and that was actually pretty cool, just the way Carradine played it. And like I said, that sci-fi aspect, when it popped up, it was only like for an episode or so, but it was believable within that setting, and it didn't dominate things. In fact, everything else, it just flowed along, but yeah, I really enjoyed Airwolf, the first season. I'm actually in the process of watching season 2 at the moment. I'll gladly do a review on that when I finish it. But I would say that season 1 of Airwolf, it's definitely worth checking out. The Blu-ray, it looks fantastic on screen. Whenever the combat scenes are going on, it looks amazing. Whenever Airwolf is doing its thing, basically you stop what you're doing just to watch it, just of how good it looks. And it really is, sort of a creature onto itself. And there's a reason that this show for a time was iconic. That helicopter, it made it. But also the characters, the pilots behind the helicopter, or within the helicopter, the characters, the actors playing the characters, they actually made you care about the thing. And so as cool as the show looks, at least I was invested in what was going on. And some people might look at this and say, OMG, it's just a cheesy 80s show, blah, 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 this is so lame. Well, okay, like I said, storytelling's improved immensely since the 80s, but, if you grew up like on shows from the 80s or 90s, stuff like this, it's not bad. Just accept that things have changed since then, and, you'll probably like the show. I would say, okay, initially I was going to do, a 4-star rating, but on further consideration, I think I'm going to go with on a 5-star scale, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. I'll give season 1 of Airwolf 4 stars out of 5. Since this is my first review, I'll just break it down real quick. 5-star, 5 stars, it's great. 4 stars, good. 3 stars, that's decent. 2 stars, 1 star, ugh, terrible. Season 1 of Airwolf, I'm gonna give 4 stars to. 4, it was a good show, or at least it was a good first season, and I would say it's definitely worth checking out. Thank you for taking the time to check out my review. I hope you enjoyed it. You got any questions? Drop a line. Let me know. Y'all have a good night.